one of the absolute beauties of doing something live is, I'm not even joking, 30 seconds ago, the doorbell rang and Robert Collins had to run and get it really quick. Right now, live, real-time front door stuff. This has happened to me about 4 times in webinars, like where people have paid and showed up. So it's pretty nutty.
You gotta love when you put something on Craigslist out there and someone just goes, "Oh, I think now's a good time to drop on by."
Oh my gosh, I can't even begin to fathom that. You know what? Let's start with the easy stuff, Bob. Tell me a little bit about where you're working right now, where you are in the world right now. We're going to talk so much nerdery today that it is not going to, everyone's going to leave at some point. But I want to know where you are right now, because Scott asked me a great question yesterday, which was, how come you don't talk so much about origin stories? And what a perfect time to roll out origin stories than with my fellow super nerd, Bob Collins. Bob, where are you now, though? Give us the in media res of it.
I don't quite have the longitude and latitude, but from that particular standpoint, but fundamentally, I am, after years of doing agency work, doing B2B tech, enterprise, everything from, software, security, middleware, and then moving into from pure communications, moving over to digital, social, community management, helping agencies grow from across the spectrum. A lot of them I have amazing collective respect for, but as you moved up in your career, you stopped being a creative. As you moved up in a career, you had the P&L, which was fantastic, because then I had a lot of amazing opportunity to mentor, foster, be amazed by the work of other people and watch them take into new steps and do things, and then help train that group of people. But the operational element always became, I got more and more distant from the clients, from the executives, from the entrepreneurs who have vision and passion. So I've actually started doing my own thing, working with Series B, Series C companies who are looking to take their vision and expand it over and actually become larger scale, SaaS tech companies that realize that communications and how you tell your story is absolutely as important as what you do. Oh, and we lost your signal there, Chris.
Courtesy is that I mute myself, and then idiocy is that I can't see the glowing green button or red that tells me that it's on or not. So let's pretend
in there.
Let's go back. So Series B means that they've already made some of their early mistakes. They have an operating budget. They kind of know where the money is or isn't, so that you don't have to fight them over like they can or can't afford you. They either can or can't, but they know they can or can't. So your grown-up person day job is helping companies kind of make that next big hump up and over from, we've got some systems, but not all the systems. We've got some ways we're talking about ourselves, but not all those ways. Is that fair enough way to talk about it?
Yeah, it's like, it's like they're focused on their product and their industry, but they're not focused on the issues that their product or the industry are evolving into. So how do you create a thought leadership element by pulling that out, putting that narrative in there, that umbrella positioning, and then they can kind of go, oh, how are we supporting our current customers? How are we talking about what's happening and changing in the industry? How can we have a voice that's not talking about us, but we can actually create a new market category, create something that actually matters, and actually have that voice, not just, there was a big thing that happened, 10 years ago where everyone just talked about content, but no one was talking about engagement, and no one was talking about, and I don't like the word influencers, but no one was talking to the people who actually already have an authority voice in there. So I'm making those connections with those people. So I usually say the joke is, you got to get your message off the 7th floor. You just have to stop making stuff up, and you have to start leading.
So you are going into companies now, as opposed to having been part of several different teams over time. It must have always been tricky to fit your very specific puzzle piece into a team. Like I can't fathom that there was ever kind of an out of the box fit for the model that is Robert Collins.
No, it's really interesting, because I tend to do, like, I think you put this adage out there many moons ago, before there was Inbound, when there was even the new marketing summit. There's a reason why God gave you 2 years in 1 month. You listen for a long period of time. You take your expertise, And I do kind of like that Peter Falk thing in Columbo. And I wait for that throwaway comment, that throwaway issue, that throwaway thing that actually is their true identity as a company, as a nerve, as their leadership team, as their founding goal. And I go, that's your crystal. Everything else can your foundation. Everything else can spur around from that. But you can't say it in the first 3 seconds. You have to like drill down until they do that throwaway.
You know, Columbo, how did you just cue me up for Columbo? So there's this dumb joke I heard a million years ago about Peter Falk, who plays Columbo, going down to Cape Cod, and he gets a little lost. And I can't do an impression of Peter Falk, but I'm going to pretend anyway. And so he's walking around somewhere in Cape Cod. He comes up to him. He says, excuse me, but could you tell me where I am? They say, you're in Athol, Mr. Falk. And the joke is that he's fucking Athol. So
he's fucking that's right up there with the bad joke of the guy who gets lost in the plane, who's driving in the fog. And he's
give it.
And okay, he's in a little nice little convenient. He's in a biplane, but he sees the tip of a building, and he goes over to the tip of the building. And he starts circling until some people come out, and he goes, "Where am I?" And they go, "You're in a plane." He goes, I know exactly where I am. I must be near Seattle, because that answer is only going to come from people who work at Microsoft, because it's absolutely accurate, but of no value whatsoever.
Oh my gosh.
That was the story probably back in the 90s.
Oh my gosh. And a throwback Microsoft joke, which is a perfect 90-degree segue to the fact that you are such a tip of the iceberg kind of guy when it comes to your nerdness. I have never come across a much more handsome rendition of comic book guy in my life. And it all starts from kind of being lost in the sauce a little bit in a very busy household. Let's start back. This is for Scott, who said, I got to do more origin stories. Who is Robert Collins in the early days, the very childy days?
I'm trying to figure out not to do my Wayne's World going or throw back the chain. But it really, a couple things. I would say one of the first early memories I've ever had was because my father knew the power of actually connecting something with something you're trying to teach somebody, creating something visually and something tactfully and something sensory to going to happen. He gave me, I was 3.5, almost 4 years old, and I still have this memory because he also took pictures of it, and those are up there. So it kept it like that branch kept on being a touchstone. July 1969, early morning. Dad pulls you in from outside playing on the street, gives you the large Betty Crocker mixing bowl full of a gallon and a half of chocolate ice cream, and said, the lunar moon landing is happening. We're going to watch it live. And I, growing up with a family of 5 brothers and, 5 brothers and sisters, full family, small Cape, 3 bedrooms, one bath. You were fighting for, like, when you got dessert at the end of the day, you got that small bowl. I had the gallon and a half chocolate ice cream, and I'm eating the entire thing and thinking, this is like the most amazing experience I've ever had. But it was that wired together, fired together moment that actually kept that memory intact. And that from that particular moment on, I had a pure infatuation for the space program, NASA, anything science fiction across the board. And that was like that grounding thing. I need to know about stories, how they're told, how they're presented. And that just like brought it out for me throughout the rest of the ages.
So my comic books and nerdy story, origin story is not the same, but has some interesting similarities. My grandpa was a candy salesman. He was the best candy salesman in Augusta, Maine. He won awards for it, got Florida trips for it, that sort of thing. $1 million sold in candy, had the plaque. And I would go around on his candy route back when there were lots of places to get candy. And I would go to Depot News, downtown Augusta, which is the Greyhound bus depot. I would go to Flo's Variety up on Sand Hill, where I never saw my grandfather sell a single thing. I just saw him hug people and tell stories. But I would get along the way the early Michael Morbius stuff with Spider-Man. I would get, which no kid should have had at that age. I was like 5. I started learning to read on things like Justice Society of America and how cool that there were generations of it. And then as I got a little older, they taught me, about the roots before that, Edgar Rice Burroughs and John Carter of Mars, as well as Tarzan and all that sort of stuff. And Asimov, what do you remember being kind of your first locked in fandom? What was the first big fandom for Robert Collins?
It took place right after first grade. There was a little story. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and there is something called Patriots Day that happens here. People come from across the nation, to the Lexington Green, to the reenactment of the Battle Green of the Redcoats and the Minutemen, the first shot high in the world, birthplace of America type thing. That particular day, we had, there was a morning parade, a big afternoon, gala. It was pancake breakfast. Then you went over to some friend's house. We got in a car late afternoon after the afternoon parade, and we were all driving home. On the way home, big old Pontiac Bonneville. My mother goes, "We have no brakes." I'm not sure what's going to go. This is back in the day. There weren't seatbelts in those back of those big old bucket seats. She says, "I can go down this road and go into a main thoroughfare, or I can take this back road and try to wind the car down on some back roads." She took the turn. It went down the hill, came right into a tree, crashed in the tree. Everyone pretty messed up. I can go into the gory details, what happened, but that's not this story. Everyone survived. Everyone was okay. Okay. There was some, ribs broken, jaws broken, things of that nature, arms broken. I went through the back window, 85 stitches across my skull. Remember the cold of being in the ambulance and that shiver as you got home. But I was released within 2 days. But some of my other family were in the hospital. While I was alone in the house, comic books came. Something to read. Because I was strained by bright lights and the TV for the head injury. So I was just in a darkened room with comic books, which seems like the perfect place. And I was given The Origin of Marvel Comic Characters by Stan Lee, that classic iconic element that talked about the origin of Thor, the origin of the Fantastic Four, the origin of the X-Men across the board, if you will, and all these amazing stories. And I was like, this is my new Bible. These were the stories that were going to, that and pulled me in, helped me through, and always connected with those origin stories and what they took on from there. And from that particular point, I think it was until my latter in junior high, I was a comic book freak. I was down at the spinner rack at the local convenience store. 75 cents in my pocket, get a Hostess Twinkie or a Hostess cupcake, bad Coke, and whatever is on the rack. And from this day, I have a collection from those that are now iconically classic.
All right, 10 million directions. This is super choose your own adventure, but I've got to connect up with one detail, which is that I was a comic book guy since age 5, but in 5th grade, I broke my collarbone in a sledding mishap. And my mom's coworker, TK Williams, would bring by big fistfuls of comics for me to read with the busted collarbone. Collarbone, by the way, is one of the dumbest bones to break. Like, there's not a lot. You basically, the way you have to treat it is you put like what looks like a bra on. There's nothing a 5th grade boy wants more than to wear a bra. And so, it's not one of those, just the the shoulder straps.
Oh yeah.
If they'd equipped it with an empty gun holster, it would have looked really cool, like one of those under the armpit gun.
Oh yeah, it could have been the Nick Fury thing, but quite not. Yeah,
exactly. See, look, no one else is gonna know, but yes, absolutely. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. 1970s edition, back when Nick was a different race. But yeah,
Jim Steranko.
So Jim Steranko's, yes. Oh my gosh, this never ends. So let's make this the segue.
Influenced by Andy Warhol, the 60s movement. We're talking probably Dali. This all came into art and comics. It's amazing.
And that time, okay, I'll go there for two more sentences, and then I got to bring everybody in because they're going to fall asleep on us. That time, there was a big movement going around inside comic books that it was the closest to psychedelic drugs you could get without taking the psychedelic drugs. Doctor Strange was in that same mode. There were all these kinds of people that, like, you know, kind of fit this like crazy art that was like diversive and all that, and very, you know, subversive, and there was all this stuff going on. But when I want to go from that, Bob, and I have two questions that kind of dovetail. One is, why was this our refuge? And then two is, you get only one wish, one character that you could be, with no weird twist arounds. Who would be the character?
Well, it's interesting. It definitely feels like a very Carrie question here, but that's quite all right. And I'll take that particular in a moment. The why question is something that probably permeates throughout my career today, because it was a combination of storytelling and the combination of the, you know, back in the earlier days with, you know, wired, you know, the fire together gets wired together. It's always with art, visual design, and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I find myself as like, my craft is writing. My heart is design and art. So when I can try, and today we have the medium and opportunity to kind of bring those things together. My son lives in the world of memes and visual arts and so on and so forth as storytelling. This goes back as the cave days back in France when they found those initial drawings. All these iconic things. And then what happened in the 70s when we found those is that they took them from comic strips and they turned into comic books, where they took an entire canvas when they had an opportunity to create that art to tell that story in a unique way. And that's always stayed with me. And I think it was that we're exploring with the X-Men, we're exploring, you know, injustice across the realm. With the Hulk, we're exploring, you know, we want to be, we're going against the system, as that's happening at that particular time. So, and the run with Neil Adams and, you know, Denny O'Neil, who unfortunately just passed away last week, who actually kind of created, you know, like the whole dichotomy of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, actually talking about social injustice issues from the right and the left, conservative and progressive elements. These are all happening during this time, and they're a voice. And that's why I always turn back to comics and Batman to be kind of the voice of where we are today, because the voice we need.
So you were raised on Marvel, but have a soft spot for Batman, something else we have in common. Let's play a little bit of One's Gotta Go. This is a recommendation by V. Carrie or O'Shea Gorgon. You've got, let's see, let me pick an X-Men. It can't can't be Cyclops. There's only weirdos like Cyclops.
Oh no, I mean Silex is, you know, he's got his own little visor thing. He's only got his own little backstory, a great leader. But to your other question, what I want to be?
Yeah. The only one. You only get one.
The only one. If I had the mental strength, it would be Xavier.
Get out. Nobody picks him. That's a really interesting choice because of that power, that ability to kind of work in and out of people's brains. Or
I think it's the power be able, because when you move through, I can do this. It goes back to my other element of listening to know what is the common ground for people to connect to try to do something better. I mean, we might live in a world where a lot of social media and content things and narratives can, you know, fear can control people. But I do feel like there's always the light that can give people that actually fuel and drive people. And I think that's one thing I always liked about Xavier. He said, we can go down one path with this power, or we can try to go down another path. So that's my answer there.
That is some answer. You know, I always, like, if you said Wolverine, I would have written you off, and you couldn't possibly have been Wolverine anyway. It just isn't the right thing. If you had said, I could have seen you doing somebody like somebody a little more supporty or something, like, you know, Bobby Drake, or I could see you picking a lot of other characters. But Xavier's like, it's a pretty choice role, but also just not the one. Now I want to give people a little sense of, you know, why Marvel. DC, by the way, DC's problem with every one of their characters is that they're almost always like otherworldly and godlike, and you know, you can never really be them, but you can just appreciate the crazy stories. Marvel's characters were all based on psychological challenges. They were all based on things that people might feel. Stan Lee wrote a lot of this. Stanley Leibowitz wrote a lot of this with the concept of, a lot of Jews were having problems in the world. He came from right around the World War II times into this world. He was still being persecuted. So the X-Men is a story of persecution and what it's like to be a weirdo and not really accepted by society. Every episode or issue of the X-Men was like, well, you saved the world again, but you're a big asshole and we hate you.
You're a mutant, you're a deviant, be done with you.
Yeah, you're bad. Hulk is, basically every child's power problem. Like, who wouldn't want to be the Hulk? You've got a bully at school, your parent hits you or something like that. The Hulk is that story of, if you had the power and could like let your anger go for a minute, what would you do with it?
And then one with the Hulk is that is how do you, he always wants to know, I know I have this inner rage. I want to learn how to better understand it. So it's always that element too.
Well, right. Because, if it was just him, what makes Hulk a real character and not like, not something that only kids want, is that he was forever battling his rage and battling with, trying to understand how to make himself a whole person. Hulk is like the only one of these guys who might actually go to a therapist. It's really interesting when you review this stuff as a grown-up. You and I also know that there's been some ages of comics, so to speak. And when we first got into it, there was a lot of energy going on for a lot of reasons. And then things got weird in the 90s. And the reason this applies to business, the reason this is interesting about this is that these ages kind of also influence your business decisions, my business decisions, how we put a lens on the world. Also has comics behind it, even though we don't explain that ever in a meeting if we can help it.
No, I mean, exactly. The comics have always been, like any good art form, have been an expression of their time, and an expression and design of their time and reflection. So how we can learn from it to better improve the world around us. And that was definitely the 70s, throughout the Vietnam War, throughout racial injustice, throughout the introduction of heroin that became a little bit more mainstream throughout the cities and things of that nature. In the 80s, we had Alan Moore's The Watchmen, who was basically talking about power and what that power was going to be doing if it was trying to unify the world, but it's having too much power across the board. We had HBO. Daniel Lindelof, when he actually recreated the new Watchmen, which was focusing upon what do we do with that seat of power when it's actually we filtered it through what's happening with endemic racism today. And you could not think of a more, like, as you were talking about, things that happen day in, day out that amazes you, and I can't believe this is happening, and the next hit keeps on coming, that we're now having a convention just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the biggest amazing uprising happened in the beginning of this century against upcoming and growing Black population that was being financially prosperous.
Right.
So it's always kind of like we're doing that social commentary and what are we learning from it, and it's always going to be that particular cycle.
And that's a thing that I always credit science fiction and comics and all that with. Star Trek and all that. Star Trek was dealing with race relations stories in the 60s. It was a huge to-do. Martin Luther King told Nichelle Nichols, stay on screen, weirdo. We need Uhuru because you are changing the world. Yeah,
she was thinking about wanting to leave, and he goes, no, you're on that bridge. You're the representation of where we're going to be in the future.
Robert Collins said on Punch-Out, you've got to find an outlet, a passionate interest that can rejuvenate you. It's great when it can be a shared experience because then it's communal. So there's that part of comics as well. Comics allows a whole bunch of socially anxious people to get together. It allows us to instantly have a secret handshake that we don't have in any other way. And when football guys would come around and say, you don't understand what it's like, because they can spout their stats and we can spout our stats. We can talk about adamantium versus vibranium. They can talk about who did, however many sports ball kick goals or whatever they call them.
I could talk about, the first appearance of Batman was in May 1939 with, Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who actually created the key elements that actually make Batman iconic. Captain America was in March 1941. Joe Simon.
Was that a racist comic early on?
Oh, Jack Kirby. Superman, June 1938. Wonder Woman, 1941. And our dear friend, Mr. Spider-Man himself, Mr. Peter Parker, when I got reinvigorated back again, was, Amazing Fantasy back in 1962, I believe. But it also goes on today. All those stats and things, so people like throw out their stats of this ball player, that ball player. I mean, do you know that Deadpool was introduced in the issue number 98 of New Mutants?
Rob Liefeld has to be blamed for that. Is it Liefeld or Liefeld? I've never known. Do you know?
I don't, and that's okay.
That's fine. I always call him Liefeld. I always call him guy who can't draw feet.
I call him Liefeld. I have no idea why, because every time he does his podcast, I can never understand what he talks about.
Who knew? John just said sports ball kicks. My coffee's all over my screen. But that's what it sounds like, John. When Robert and I keep trying to call you Bob, but I'm honoring you. Robert and I did play sports ball with the other boys. It's just, we did it to fit in. It was like being gay. I mean, being a comic fan was a lot like being gay when you were a kid. Being a nerd was like that. Like, it was not cool. And then one day, the geeks did inherit the earth, and all of a sudden my kids all wear Deadpool shirts to school. And it's a strange time. I want to talk about that because you and I and everybody kind of vanished from comics for some duration as we must put away childish things and blah, blah, blah.
That's all
my return was that Secret Wars run that came out, the recent one with the Skrulls and everything. And that was, I don't even remember when now it's like early mid 2000s or something. And that was the real run that made me go, oh my gosh, I forgot why I liked the storytelling aspects of books. When did you vanish from this, and when did you come back?
I hate to use the word red-blooded American back in the day, but it was like, there's only so many times I could take the bus over to Minuteman Tech Institute and learn assembly and program and Fortran and basic language, so I could write my own code on my TRS-80. And then comic books. And then it was like 9th or 10th grade when I woke up and just kind of said, oh, there's interesting people around me. And they don't all roll dice and are paladins, if you will. So from that particular point, but it was a combination while I was in college that this one came out, which was the actually very first introduction, the Secret Wars run by
original Secret Wars, first black costume.
Yes, where the very first appearance of Spider-Man's black costume, which
AKA quasi the first appearance of Venom.
Exactly, because that was actually the ball, the intelligence, and the alien that came down when he had his suit element back and forth. Then later on, it actually became a good friend of mine who I grew up, Michele Delfino, who moved away to Minneapolis. And she was involved in Ryko Disc, and everyone was just pummeling her with like amazing tapes she worked with David Bowie and Elvis Costello, and there was a whole comics thing out there. And she introduced me to Kurt Busiek in Astro City and his run, where he looked at, let me take a look at comic book characters, not from like we're mighty, but from the view of the world around them and how they're dealing with that. Almost like Alex Ross did with Marvels back in the day. And that kind of brought me back into that whole era, then got me going, oh, I have to go back and now kind of re-engage in this, because I was out of college, still single, doing my thing, but it was always the storytelling that was absolutely amazing. And it was Kurt Busiek's Astro City run that said, I got to go back into this. But when I was in college, it was Alan Moore's The Watchmen, and each issue, which I visually have, and I actually have one issue signed by Mr. Moore himself.
I've got to go to this because you and I have a vividly different spin on this. I keep nothing. Anything in my house is not more than a couple years old. Really isn't. And not like that everything's new and shiny way, just like, fuck it, I don't need it, don't need it, don't need it. I have one small box of some of my clippings of stuff like, Success Magazine and that. Really only for like my parents and my kids eventually. That's it. Other than that, I have no mementos. You keep everything. You are a collector. Talk about that.
Well, it's interesting. I was redoing my house about a year and a half ago, and I purchased my family's house. So in the basement, which is by many people back then, it was just known as the bunker. Would you have to sign a little waiver before you go downstairs, because you might not come back because you don't know what's going to be down there. But everything is down there. But 2 years ago, I got rid of 2.5 ton dumpsters worth of stuff. And I've only kept the most iconic things that kind of melt them onto me. And it goes back to the origin element of being 7 people in a small house. How do you have that touchstone of your own self? These became like my touchstones. These became like, I understand that. I recognize that. It brings me back to that place. It matters to me. I can let things go a lot more readily now. But for every 10 things I have, I only have 1.
There can be only 1?
We're no Highlandering reference here, but I mean, like, but I still do collect this. Like, there was like this amazing iconic Ditko cover for Spider-Man. So I'm like going, I want to get it for the art, but I do want to share. And then there was the other week, there was the 80th anniversary of Detective Comics.
Oh wow!
So this, once again, this came back in 1985 or like 1939, and this is the Alex Ross recreation of the actually original element here. But this, I don't have the original Batman, but what I do have, and I'll share this with you, and this is the last of the collection sharing, and I might give you a little preview the other day. This is one of the iconic comic book covers of all the 1970s, and maybe some people say of all collective time for capturing it. This is the Muhammad Ali versus Superman fight by Neil Adams and Denny Connor. But like, and on the cover, they created. My son would kill me right now because I don't let him touch us without gloves.
Without gloves, I'm holding my breath.
But he has like all these amazing icons from the 70s across, and just here in the front, they have Batman, they have Jimmy Carter. And over here actually is Telly Savalas, but they couldn't get the right.
Who loves you, baby?
Who loves you, baby? But they couldn't get the rights for Telly Savalas, so they were like, know what they did? They just removed his lollipop from his hand. But in the rest of this, there's Lucille Ball. There's actually and then some artists they couldn't get, like down here. There's actually John Wayne, but he couldn't get the rights for John Wayne, so he just put a mustache on him, and he's right next to Johnny Carson. Anyways,
oh my gosh, Karnak himself. Listen, so I have a question about this. There is a thing about nerds and super nerds and comic nerds that we love. Like when you and I talk, I have never once floated a reference by you that you didn't know, or you must be the fastest Googler on earth. Why is that our badge of pride? Why is that? You're a museum, Bob. You're a museum waiting for guests to come in with a ticket. Why?
And it's interesting because if you if I had a piece of paper and someone said, write the top things you like about the X-Men down, I don't know if I could do it. Because it was just like, it wouldn't come right off the cash. But having these conversations or that reference out there, or like in that bad episode of MASH, when he smells something tactile, it like brings back this flashback memory every time. And the conversations that you've been having with catch-up people, I'm chiming in there because, and this is, I jokingly say, it's a curse, not a gift, because all they're doing is just rewiring what's currently there and just bringing it forth. And it just goes back to the early conversation of what gets fired together gets wired together. And there's just something out there that's just going to bring it back up. But we love doing it with other people who respect it, because what you can do is you get that little bit of, it's always about recognition and community. And they get you get me, noob, you get me.
Exactly. So, oh my gosh, there is, to me, I think that's my answer to that question. Sort of, why do I do this? There's a line in the song Christian Sands by Tricky where he says, it means we'll manage. I'll master your language. And in the meantime, I'll create my own. And the idea of sort of shared language, the idea that like, even when we wrote Trust Agents, Julian Smith and I stuck in some parts, like we talked about rolling for saving throws. And, when people read that in Trust Agents in 2009, they were like, oh my God, saving throws, because that's that feeling we have. And I think, humankind's greatest need, according to Stephen Covey, is the need to feel wanted.
Yep.
And I think that there were so many of us who just didn't have any other connecting tissues, to other ways that we wanted to connect. And we just didn't have this vast field of dreams to play in without this set of tools. And I think those two things together made the secret layer, don't you think?
Oh yeah, but it also reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite authors, Jonathan Lethem, who is it was Jonathan Carroll in White Apples, when he just says the secret of life in people actually is not just to be is to be understood, and not just respected, to be understood, like the layer down in that area. So sometimes it's that touchstone of connection and something that they just kind of go, we had no idea you were on the other part of the globe. I was doing this, but this moment that we don't even know still connects us. And and it is finding that gestalt of humanity. As you do that, you can do almost anything together if you can find those sparks together.
So I don't know if Scott Woodard is still here, but we talked about your origin story and how that relates to your current role. Do you find yourself using this? Do you find yourself using your vast encyclopedic knowledge of all things weird ass pop culture in some way in your business application, or does it have to matter?
I get two answers to that. It actually helps me because two reasons. Or the work actually helps my brain because it actually helps me focus. But then every once in a while, when I'm pulling a parallel that it needs to like be brought forth, I can give a cultural, I can give a economic, I can give a political reference from something from days of yore. That actually kind of brings that back to life, because everything new is old and everything old is new again. And it's those touch points that you can bring back. So writing narratives and stories and pitches and missions and content, if I can bring a context to it without going down the nerd camp too much, but just cultural wise, because I'm not just connecting to, that 12%, which is now 40%. But to like even larger, I still have to bring those cultural references, and being able to bring that forth makes those stories actually matter a little bit more because they're put in perspective, and hopefully they actually make the story move a little bit more too.
It's really, it's a whole other planet. But what I also find, here's a story that ties into this. Another totally not related segue. This feeling. I had a random experience in an airport with someone who just had a birthday a couple of days ago, and that's the only way I'll out this guy, in which he said, "Hey, you're into comics, right?" This is like 5 years ago airport story. And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he like shows me kind of his Wednesday grabs that he's bringing with him on the plane. And he goes, "I don't talk to anybody about this." And I was like, "Well, why?" It's cool now. Like, people are getting oddly sick of superhero movies, whereas we spent our entire childhood wishing a vaguely decent superhero movie would come around. We had to deal with
if there could be one back in the day. It's not Richard Corman's Fantastic Four version.
Nope, it's not that really crappy Captain America where he wore a helmet, like a motorcycle helmet. It's not Spider-Man with his coffee ground, or his like sink drain eyes from the 70s. Nicholas, what's his name?
Nicholas Hall. But you can only and his only really Hall of Fame outside of that is the bad reference he had in The Sound of Music. But that's don't do that. He was in Sound of Music.
Oh my gosh, you go deep. You know how there's like a B side of a 45? Bob's like the C side or something. There's like another whole piece. New comics come out on Wednesdays, Steve Garfield. So every comic nerd knows what's going on Wednesdays, because that's when the new stuff hits. So it's kind of interesting nowadays. It's funny, stuff that I talked about as far back as Trust Agents is starting to be done, which is I have a guy in my little town here, Mick. He doesn't sell comics as much anymore. He's a game store that accidentally has some comics. But Mick would on Wednesdays send me photos of my comics, not the comics, my comics.
Oh, you're collecting
this title. Here's another one. Here's a poll for you. And I never subbed to any particular comic. I never subscribed and picked up a run. But, when there's a guy like sending you photos on your text or tweeting them to you, you go, "Oh, I guess I'll go in." And he got so much more money out of my pocket because he'd tweet me photos of my comics.
Well, it's interesting. And I'll bring this element up here. When, COVID-19 happened and retail was decimated and across the board and restaurants were decimated. One of the interesting things was there's a place called the Holo Comics in Southport, Massachusetts, down off of Route 9. amazing. Jake and John, just amazing, great people. But what they did during that particular time, how everyone kind of pivoted, they went, oh, here's your pull file. We're actually going to send you pictures of these right now. We will mail these to you because you're spending over $20. We'll do that at our cost. Would you like to keep this run going? It will be helpful for us, but more importantly, we believe in the community. What can we do for you?
Right.
And it wasn't until the DC shipping stopped actually publishing because they just couldn't, that supply chain was diminished. But I looked at them as being, we're just not a retail store. We're a community connection. And then they did ongoing things, other things to keep those, because it wasn't about the product. And this is one thing I'm always telling my clients, it's about the community you're building with your product. And if you don't, you need to tap into that as much as possible.
It's totally the thing. And I've seen, so I follow a few different comic writers, Scott Snyder, Greg Pak, interviewed some of those guys for things. And what they're also doing in this time frame is they're dumping in, they're kind of making bum rushes of small indie stores who are having trouble because of this all being shut down, and also giving some people some ideas for some cool back catalog pulls while they're dealing with COVID, because it's a perfect time to go into the bins, which helps everybody. It helps the store get rid of some of their inventory that they haven't been able to shed. And it helps, new readers or dads like you, get their kid into it. Although if it's anything like mine, my oldest is 18, hated every single thing I'm into, but then really slowly comes back and starts to get into it a lot after the fact.
Yeah, they sometimes resent the buttons we installed on them. So until they find how they, maybe that I'm a little wired like this too.
Utterly so. Let's end it here. I think it's a good time. I think we've hit all the buttons. I think we've hit all the notes. I mean, I can't believe we kept this many people entertained for this long. It was purely by force of Robert Collins' will and his good looks. You can follow him on Robert Collins on the Twitter. And I asked him, where's your website? And he goes, I am a man behind the scenes. I do all the hard work for all these people. I don't have my own website. I have their websites. So that's the thing. Find Robert wherever you want to find him. Thank you so much for coming on and being part of this.
And I'm glad we kept this going from your birthday, where I send you something unique and interesting that you didn't recognize, to bring it back from the touch phone, because that also gave me the spirit during this time to kind of go, I got to give something to Chris this morning because it makes me happy to share that with somebody I know who will respect it.
I get a daily delivery from Robert, and every single day there is something that just really fills me up. How old are your kids? Or no, I guess Carol's asking Carrie, how old are Carrie's kids? I don't know, teenager-y. Thanks everyone for showing up. I'm hitting the end. You guys can comment all you want, but we're leaving. See ya. Bye. Merry Christmas.
Ciao. Merry Christmas.